I've been thinking about a lot of different things in this last month. 2021 was quite the year. In a lot of ways, it was kind of great. COVID vaccines were developed and released. We had days and weeks where it almost felt like a new normal again. Jimmy and I got engaged, we both started new jobs, and we bought our first house here in DC. In a lot of ways, 2021 was also kind of terrible. We still had to do the whole pandemic thing. Too many people died, and funerals had to be delayed or downsized. And there have been massive divisions formed within families that seem too big to rebuild. In sum, 2021 was a lot for all of us. In addition to just this year, 2021, I've also been reflecting a lot on this last decade. I'll turn 30 on Thursday, and so I've been thinking back on and making mental notes of all that I got to do in my 20s. On this day, January 2nd, 2012, exactly 10 years ago, I boarded a plane and flew to France for a semester abroad during college. It was an incredible experience with people who grew to be some of my most special friends. And later, I got to live in Belfast, Northern Ireland for a year, where I discerned my call to seminary and ministry. And then I went back to France to live there for a year and to teach English. And then during seminary, I got to spend another birthday on a travel seminar in India. And then I got to spend another semester studying in Prague. So by my count, I got to pack up and move to a new country 4 separate times during my 20s. I got very good at knowing exactly how much stuff to bring and what I would be able to carry on my own back. I love that I had all these opportunities to live and learn from people with different perspectives and backgrounds. It helped shape my understanding of humanity and God's work in the whole world. But it could also be really hard to live someplace temporarily. Going to a new place when you already know the date that you're going to be leaving makes it hard to build relationships. When you know you'll be leaving, it takes me a lot of energy to initiate and maintain community. It's possible you can do it, but it doesn't quite feel the same. And in some ways, I think that those relationships are made more special by their brevity, but mostly, I think that a lack of time didn't really help us out. In his gospel, John tells us in verse 14 that the Word became flesh and lived among us. The Word became flesh and lived among us. This wasn't some sort of temporary living situation. The Word wasn't coming to couch surf for just a few nights. The Word wasn't packing a backpack to rent a room for a semester. The Word lived among us. In the Greek, the word used here is the same word used in the Exodus to pitch a tent. It means the Word took up residence among us. This is what is so incredible about the incarnation. What makes Christmas, this whole season, such a huge deal. The Word, who John later identifies as Jesus Christ, is coming to be among humans and among all of creation permanently. Michael Linvall tells us this on the significance of the incarnation. Incarnation is the declaration that just as God is in the Spirit that often fills Christmas Day, God is also in the day after, indeed, in every day to come. With all the pomp and celebration of Christmas, these days that follow can seem a bit empty. But the incarnation means that this day and every day to come is just as full of God's Spirit as the day before. Each new day bears that same declaration that God is with us. The way John puts together the opening of his gospel, talking about the Word with a capital W, also marks that this is something a bit different. By naming it the Word rather than Jesus Christ, we recognize something that isn't human. But then, with the Word becoming flesh and living among us, we recognize a piece of our own humanity. And yet, we understand that whatever is happening with this becoming flesh and living among us is still not quite human in the way we know it. Through all the stories we've been hearing over the last several weeks about the angels and the birth of Jesus, we've been reminded time and time again that this is something special. The incarnation is both extremely intimate and extremely different. Jesus coming to live among us, taking on our humanity, living with us as a vulnerable baby, all while being fully divine. Nothing about what we read should make sense to us. God coming to be human with us. The Word becoming flesh. This is amazing stuff that we have heard so many times that it might not sound so special anymore. The gift of God choosing to be with us on earth is incredible. On this first weekend of the new year, I hope that we can look at this story with fresh eyes, eyes ready to see something new. In this prologue of sorts, John talks about what happens to us through the Word. In verse 12, we read that he gave the power to become children of God to all who received him. Again, John is pointing out how things are different. No longer are we bound to one another by blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man. We are bound to one another by God, and we are bound to God. We are given power to become children of God. I like the use of the word power here because really it is a sort of power that we receive to become children of God. On the one hand, we're made children of God because God chooses us to be children of God. And on the other hand, we are tasked with a response to this power to become children of God. But what are we supposed to do with this power? What happens if we accept this power? It's not like we're joining a club. We don't become children of God for the perks or the swag, the monthly delivery. By becoming children of God, we are invited into God's eternal activity, working to redeem all of God's creation. When God adopts us, we're invited to join with God. We're no longer bound by the will of the flesh or the will of man, but bound to one another by God, which means that we are able to shift our priorities to line up with God's priorities. By taking on flesh and living among us, God not only brings God's self closer to us, but God also brings us closer to God's work in the world and calls us to join in. God's work that we are called to join in on is the work that John tells us about in Jesus Christ. He writes that grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. Through Christ, we have received grace upon grace. The work we are called to is to make known the grace and the truth of Jesus Christ. And what have we done with that grace? As humans, we have been building systems and structures that benefit ourselves far more than they benefit others. We've been bound by the ties to will of the flesh and the will of man when we should be bound by our identity as children of God. Rather than lifting up the ways God is at the center of it all, we continue to think that we are at the center of it all. We have oppressed and destroyed beloved members of God's creation. The response to the grace we receive should not be to flaunt it. Our response to grace in our lives should be to make sure others know grace in their lives. Our response to truth can be a little trickier to figure out. If we've learned anything in the last couple of years, it's that people like to use the word truth differently. We all have different truths, bound to the circumstances and experiences we have known in our own lives. And those different truths can collide with each other. But God's truth is something different. God's truth is ultimate, not subject to our human construction. I don't think that we can know the fullness of God's truth, but being fully divine, Jesus knew God's truth. Jesus, fully human, fully God, makes known God to us. And by making known God, Jesus makes known God's truth. So if we take a look at Jesus' life and we hear his words and listen to his teachings, then maybe we can get a better idea of what God's truth is. We know God because we know Jesus. We know Jesus because he became flesh and dwelled among us. He came not as a wandering nomad, not as a short-term guest, but as a permanent fixture in our lives. As children of God, we have seen God's grace and truth in our own lives, and we are called to share that grace and truth with others. We won't always get it right, but as long as we continue to seek God in all that we do, we can help build just a little bit more of God's kingdom here among us. The Word became flesh and lived among us. Thanks be to God. Amen.